Well, good evening. Thank you for joining Live Border News. I'm your host, Johnathon Alexander, and just want to give a reminder tonight that America Fest is going to be starting this Saturday on the 16th in Phoenix, Arizona. We're going to be live there in Phoenix, and that will last from the 16th through the 19th. I'll be right back with you guys, and we're going to get our show going. All right, good evening. I appreciate you guys coming back on tonight. And we have our special guest back, Richard Gage. And Richard Gage is an AIA, is a 30-year San Francisco Bay Area architect and member of the American Institute of Architects. He is the founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers. And we have been discussing about 9/11 and going over about the explosions of the towers and bringing the truth to you guys. He now leads the charge for a new World Trade Center investigation along with his courageous wife and assistant, Gail, at richardgage911.org. And I'm going to be bringing Richard live here now.
Hello, John.
Good evening, Richard.
Hi, how's it going?
It's great having you back on our show.
Nice to be here. It'll be nice to finish up where we left off because we had that technical interruption.
Yes, we did. Well, hopefully everything will go smooth tonight.
I hope so, too.
So, if we can continue where we kind of let off last night, that would be great. Let's see, and I think we have it right here. There we go.
Hey, that's the one. Yeah, let's dig right into it, shall we? Because we had gone through the first 5 features of controlled demolition that we found in the World Trade Center towers. Of course, in session 1, we looked at the 3rd tower that came down, World Trade Center Building 7. A 47-story skyscraper that was not hit by a plane, but which went down anyway in the exact manner of a classic controlled demolition. And so if you guys missed that, we encourage you to check out session 1. We resume now with the Twin Towers, noting that the National Fire Protection Guide, 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation, it is the booklet in this country and many, many others for fire and explosion investigation. It says, look for shrapnel effects when you're finding effects of explosions. And indeed, we do have high order damage, which is characterized by shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished and debris thrown great distances. That's exactly what we have, of course, in the Twin Towers. We already talked about the dissemination of these individual structural steel elements, the distribution and the shattering of them down to their original components, completely shattered, like to 37.5-foot lengths, ready for loading and shipment. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. The perimeter columns shattered, ready for loading and shipment, with very little actual having to have the ironworkers come in and cut them into pieces. They did a pretty decent job, and you can see that here too with feature number 7, the lateral ejection of structural steel elements 600 feet in every direction at 80 miles an hour. Well, the NFPA Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation says look for blast pressure wave effects as well. Heavy structural steel sections freely flying, in other words, as we see embedded into the skyscrapers all around the World Trade Center towers, up to 500 feet away and 600 feet away, destroying the winter gardens in the World Financial Center. We see those freely flying structural steel sections landing up to those distances in all of these images. In fact, look at this one. That is about to hit World Trade Center 7. Let's go back to forward 2. That's 45 degrees. How does gravity work, John? Do you remember? Down.
Down.
And in this case, we have out. So what's going out? It's ejected laterally. This is a 4-ton structural steel section, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these. And then gravity begins to take over, and we get the beginning of down until they're sent up to 600 feet in every direction. By the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is distributed well outside the footprint, because only maybe 5% of the steel is actually steel landing at the bottom. It's most all ejected out. What's crushing the building? We're told that the building is being crushed by the upper section above the point of plane impacts, that it drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself, except for the fact that up to 95% of it is not even there. So we have a real problem here with the official narrative, which uses all of that steel to crush that building, but it's not there. It's been distributed beyond, a lot of it, the World Trade Center complex. Maybe it's the concrete, because let's look at feature number 8 of controlled demolition, the pulverization or the breaking up of concrete in traditional controlled demolitions. We're looking for 110 floors. Each of them are an acre in size, but they're missing. On the left, all we see is a 4 or 5 story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, that 5% of the structural steel that managed to remain and fall to the bottom inside the footprint of the building.
Wow.
Right. Yeah, right. On the right.
Yeah. How do 108 floors come up missing?
110.
Or 110. Yeah. Unbelievable.
50 of them. We don't find 10. We don't even find 1. And again, an acre in size. On the right is a traditional pancaking collapse, like in an earthquake in Mexico. Where is all the concrete? It is not here. Where did it go? Oh, there it is. It's pulverized in midair. Pulverized to a fine powder. All the photos, all the videos show 90,000 tons of concrete in each of these buildings, pulverized to 100 micron particles. It's like an ash, actually. It's not even gravel. It's been completely pulverized. This would take high energy explosives, which is why we had all those pieces of explosions before the tower collapsed in session number 2. So here in session number 3, we're going into some deeper rabbit holes. For instance, the concrete powder, here's where it is, well outside the footprint of the tower, distributed, as you see, in these massive clouds of pulverized concrete into a blanket 3 inches thick, covering downtown Manhattan from river to river. That's where the concrete is. If that's where the concrete is, John, why? What's crushing the building? It
Yeah,
wasn't
exactly.
the steel. That was easily more than a third of the building. This is another third of the building's weight. So, though none of the weight, hardly any of the weight of the concrete or the steel is available to crush the building, and yet that's what Zdeněk Bazant used, who was the engineer justifying the gravitational collapse, as NIST calls it, for NIST. He used all of this weight to crush the building. But if it's distributed over a 3 square mile area across lower Manhattan, it's not there to crush the building, then, is it?
Yeah,
This is
exactly.
extremely important point. Well, actually, there was another witness, seismic evidence provided by the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. They're 20 miles north of the North Tower, or the World Trade Center complex, and they recorded some seismic information near the time of the collapse of the towers. And FEMA and NIST relied on this for their Columbia University, in the Columbia University report. Let's look at it. A 2.1 magnitude earthquake near the time of the collapse. So NIST says, well, this is, again, for those of you who weren't with us on the first episode, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. Well, here's how they explain it. Oh, yeah, you have a 2.1 magnitude event. This has to be the building hitting the ground. Okay. Well, that's for the South Tower. The North Tower, we have a 2.3 magnitude event. Same thing. They say it's due to the building hitting the ground. But let's look at this real carefully. Because we have the, here, let me increase the size of this. Hold on one second. Here we go. We have the seismic signal occurring at 10:28 and 31 seconds. Well, the tower starts descending 9 seconds before that, and the first debris doesn't hit the ground until a second later, and the major debris doesn't hit the ground until 4 seconds later. So how can the seismic signal, which happens well after the debris, well before the debris hitting the ground, be caused by the debris hitting the ground? There we go. Well, NIST has an answer to this. They contract with Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and Columbia University to move their data back 3 seconds so that they can try to account for this discrepancy. Now, there was a report made, but we don't have access to it. We can't get a Freedom of Information Act request for it.
And they don't want to release it to you. Huh.
No, they do not, because it would show that no way did that seismic signal cause, was that seismic signal caused by that debris? Well, what could have caused that seismic signal? Let's look at the very well-formed P wave and S wave on each side of the beginning of the tower's descent so that we can get a handle on this. I mean, we're talking 4 seconds before the tower ever descended. Does that sound familiar to anybody who had looked at session number 1? What did we hear from 186 first responders? That there were explosions,
Bang, bang,
many of them
bang.
describing
Yep.
before the tower collapsed, right? Seconds before the tower collapsed. So this is actually corroborating the testimony of the first responders. In fact,
Right.
let's go to 6 and 10 seconds before the tower ever came down. What were you going to say, John?
So the explosions is what probably caused the shaking.
Well, that's what's proved right here, because you
Exactly.
can see the shaking, because this is a camera mounted on a tripod, and there's a shake 6 seconds before the collapse. And this is from Graham McQueen's research, the late great Graham McQueen, who just died very unfortunately a few months ago. Okay, we're looking at the tower. There's the shake. I'm not shaking it. That was a tripod mounted on the ground responding to the explosion. And then 6 seconds later, the North Tower begins its descent. So that is direct evidence. This happens again with another camera on a rooftop. Watch. In this case, the shake happens right after the broiling there's the shake right after the explosion on the top of the tower, and the explosion is probably all down into the basement, but it caused the shaking of that camera. And then in this case, 10 seconds later, the building begins its smooth, sudden descent that we talked about in session 1. What about the South Tower? Because we have, again, the start of a seismic event at 9:59 and 04 seconds in the morning. But the tower starts collapsing before that, but the first debris doesn't hit the ground until 7 seconds later. So how can the first debris hitting the ground cause the seismic signal 7 seconds earlier? It can't.
Exactly.
What does
Wow.
NIST do about this? They get LDEO to move their data back yet again 3 seconds so that they can solve this technical problem that exposes their fraud. What could have caused those signals? Once again, we go back to cameras mounted on tripods. In this case, New York 1 camera. Let's take a look at it, because it begins to shake, in this case, 3 seconds before the collapse. Watch carefully. This one's more subtle. There's the shake. And then 3 seconds later, the entire building begins its descent. So again, it's corroborating those first responders whom we heard talking about explosions seconds before the towers came down. And so we have the official narrative telling us that seismic signals near the time of the collapse are due to the debris hitting the ground. But there's a problem here. The concrete floors and floor trusses and gypsum board walls and building contents were pulverized to dust, essentially. There's no seismic component from all that concrete spreading out 3 square miles across lower Manhattan in the form of dust. None whatsoever. That's 90,000 tons of weight in each building that has no seismic component whatsoever. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units only 4 to 8 tons each, which are peppering the ground over a period of 15 to 30 seconds, depending on how you time the collapse. So there's no seismic component 20 miles away from a 4 or 8 ton structural steel component hitting the ground, further clarifying that it was not the building that caused these seismic components. And they're equally distributed over the entire World Trade Center superblock. Their seismic component, uh, they are spread out geographically across and beyond the World Trade Center complex. How about the NIST report itself? They were tasked by Congress to explain the collapses to the American people, and their objectives were, in this $20 million funded effort, to determine why and how World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. Building 7 also. We talked about that in session 1 of this 3-part series. Well, they spent 2 years and producing 10,000 pages in their effort to explain that, but they only have 1/2 of a page on the events following the collapse initiation. In other words, the actual collapse accounts for 1/2 of a page of these 10,000 pages. Well, what does it say? It's hidden on footnote 13, their own objective. Not the objective that Congress gave them, but their own. Page 82, footnote 13. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You had $20 million, 10,000 pages. You were tasked with explaining the collapses, but you only explained what happened up to the point of the initiation of collapse? This it turns out that they actually simply say in that half page, which I need to add into this component of ours today. They say the building component below was not able to resist the heavy mass up above. So it came down essentially in free fall. That's what it says on that half page.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, Richard. Wow.
No structural calculations analyzing the capability of the building below, the cold, hard, intact steel, 80,000 tons of structural steel. They don't explain its inability to resist the force of the lighter object above. Remember, it's like the Volkswagen running into the Mack truck.
Right.
No, there's nothing whatsoever. They simply rely on the fact that the building collapsed. So they didn't have to analyze it. They actually say that. It's incredible. Well, what do the other experts say? Here's William Rice, a structural engineer. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the twin towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor, while maintaining a near freefall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structural framework underneath didn't even exist. That's really logical and clear. We can intuitively understand that. This gets even better. David Scott, structural engineer. Near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. You can memorize that one. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. That's very clear. Well, what happened to the evidence? Was it preserved so structural engineers could get their hands on it and do a proper forensic investigation? Let's listen to structural engineer Abulhassan Astani Azal from the University, professor from University of California, Berkeley.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In fact, in easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, 400 truckloads a day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, was sent to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. But you know what, John? They didn't have to abide by these crime scene preservation laws, because this was declared an act of war due to the plane that did or didn't hit the Pentagon.
Boy.
The attack on the Pentagon, regardless.
Yeah, they had their bases covered, I'll tell you.
Oh, yeah. If you think this was an operation that they must be very proud of themselves, because it's taking us 20 years to break through the wall of denial here, denial of the truth about 9/11. But we've got to move into and look very carefully at the evidence of extreme heat here, because this gets down into the rabbit hole of what really caused the destruction of all three skyscrapers on 9/11. Let's listen to Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor segment.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the three collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out of the fire?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the three collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was the core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot-long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
You get the point there. It's something spooky is going on here. In fact, the World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, says there was a little river of steel flowing. Now, the beginning melting point of steel is 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 or 4 times as hot as these office fires ever could have been. So the official narrative of this building's collapse, including jet fuel, which only burns at 600 degrees Fahrenheit, according to ME Petroleum, one of the main manufacturers. And look at the fires. They're diminished at the time of the collapse. The thick black smoke indicates that these are oxygen-starved and cooler fires. In other words, cooler, meaning 3 or 4 or 500 degrees maximum. A quarter of the temperatures that are documented here, including these witnesses, metal dripping from a beam. You can see the liquid metal falling out of the material held in the claws of the crab claw excavator. Molten steel beams.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
It was freaking them out. We can tell the temperature of molten metal like this because of its color. It's just the physics of molten metals. This is 2,500 degrees minimum, and white hot even, so much hotter than that. The Police Museum today in New York holds this chunk of previously molten concrete. I didn't even know concrete could melt. It melts at about 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit, more than steel melting, more temperature required. Fire temperature is so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path, including this handgun, which was recovered from World Trade Center 6, which is why it's in the Police Museum, because that was the police headquarters for the World Trade Center. So what could be causing all of this extreme heat? Are incendiaries a possibility? Could thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter, could it have produced all that molten metal? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting here somewhere, John, because finally we might have the answer here, because we have all of this elemental iron. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for over 100 years, and yet this is iron, and it's molten. It's exceeding 4,000 degrees coming out of thermite. So that could explain the extreme temperatures. And it would explain the presence of sulfur, which is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So
if they have not used this kind of iron in these buildings for years, what's their explanation for why it was recovered melted like that?
There is no explanation. In fact, NIST destroyed the Appendix C that FEMA before them had produced with the metallurgical examination. They didn't destroy it. They took it out of the report when they took over that investigation from FEMA, and we have no accounting for it. In fact, they actively deny it, which we saw in session 1 of this 3-part series. So there you go. They deny that sulfur had anything to do with this, too, suggesting even that sulfur might have come from the gypsum board, because gypsum board has calcium sulfate in it. But gypsum board has been used for about 100 years to protect steel from fire. It's not going to it's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's been designed to protect for a century. Excuse me. So we have unusual residues that could arise from thermite. In the NFPA 921, in the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, it says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite. NIST says they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, did you look? Nope. A year later, they finally admit NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. First, they deny it, that they didn't find any, that there wasn't any. And then they admit that they never looked for it. But others did, of course. And one of them was a nuclear physicist, Stephen Jones, formerly from Brigham Young University. He says if thermite were used, it would produce a characteristic burn pattern. What's that? A white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. And we know that that's over 2,500 degrees there, right? Talked about that. And a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash. What's that? Well, that's what we see rising from the material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. And like we see trailing these freely flying structural steel objects, which we now realize the ends of which are molten metal. And we're beginning to discover how they got molten. And that they are molten because they're trailing thick white smoke clouds. Steel is not flammable like wood. So how are the ends of these steel columns or beams trailing thick white smoke clouds? Take a look. It happens in each of the towers, thousands of them. All of these thick white smoke clouds trailing these solid objects that are hurled out of the towers, Looks more like a volcanic eruption again in the Tongan Sea in 2009. Upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying solid objects trailing thick white smoke clouds. So Dr. Jones says the signature of thermite would also leave behind unique chemical evidence, common elements like iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but more unusual elements also, like fluorine and manganese, left behind in the residue, for which there's no other explanation. These elements in the periodic table of the elements.
Wow.
He gets pretty curious. So somebody sends him a piece from this 40-pound chunk of previously molten metal. They call them meteorites because it looks like it came from space. They were freaked out at this stuff. He does electron microprobe data, and he finds that it's predominantly iron. This is not a chunk of steel. This is elemental iron, which is the byproduct of thermite, you might remember. And the other byproduct is, well, he rules out molten aluminum from the jet, the planes. And it has abundant manganese, which should not be found in steel either. He rules out structural steel as a major component. The molten metal, previously molten, has also aluminum, sulfur, and potassium, the byproduct of thermite. So he's proven that this piece of steel was the byproduct of thermite through the electron microprobe data, but it has manganese and fluorine in abundance. Where would that come from? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite charges. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels, which we're going to get to. So these elements are part of a fingerprint of thermite very clearly. But sol gels would leave yet another important residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. What's that? Doesn't matter. The EPA, it matters. But the EPA says one molecule that was present at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. It's completely unique, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Well, yet another sample comes from this 9/11 monument to the world, the International Peace Park in Manitoba, Canada. This piece of slag was sent to Dr. Jones. He does X-ray fluorescence to try to find what's in it. What does he find? Iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, all the evidence of thermite ignition yet again separately in this piece. Well, if you're going to cut through beams and columns to clear up the World Trade Center, you're going to use an oxyacetylene torch, which cuts very cleanly from point A to point B, extremely hot. That's not what you get when something else is doing the job, something like thermite cutter charges, which have been used before. For instance, in the takedown of the towers, in the World's Fair in 1950. It's rare. They usually use something else, high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, but they provide a very loud bang and a bright flash.
Hey, Richard.
Which would give away what was going on here. Yeah.
Not to interrupt you, Bobby Alvarez just got them making a comment on here. He says, while reviewing the 9/11 attack, I noticed two flying Two things fly out of the tower at a high rate of speed when the first jet drone hit. It's all there for everyone to see if you look at the videos in slow motion.
Yeah, I think that's true. When the jet impacted the tower, we have landing gear flying through and out the other side, and a lot of other components as well.
Right.
So in this case, you have slag, thick slag pouring down the 45-degree cut on the core column that we can see plainly. Again, if they're going to cut these, you have firefighters are still doing rescue operations here. This is not a cut by the iron workers who came later. In fact, there's all kinds of cuts in these columns, which look very, very suspicious. But these are not 45-degree cuts, which is typical with controlled demolition. So I don't know what caused these. But you can make thermite cutter charges in your own backyard, like John Cole, civil engineer, did. In fact, and they cut very cleanly, as you can see. But here's one of his experiments. They're not really explosions. They're more muted, but you can hear them. And thousands of them going off, you'd be able to hear. So it cuts, in this case, almost completely cleanly through, allowing what? Razor thin edges and a complete corrosion and hot temperature erosion of the steel, like the Appendix C that FEMA did that I mentioned, showed in the FEMA report of 2002 in May. A 1-inch column thinned to half-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness, just like John Cole found when he did his backyard thermate experiment. Again, these are patented devices that were available prior to 9/11, which use molten iron to cut through much thicker sections of steel than C4 and RDX can. It's like hot plasma. In fact, there are devices whose entire casings are built, made from consumable, consolidated thermite. Nothing left behind but molten iron. So you wouldn't have all of these casings from cutter charges laying around as evidence. Nor would you have wires and miles of det cord, which is typical in controlled demolitions, because these can be remotely, wirelessly activated. But what else was found in the fine powder, ubiquitous, river to river, as we mentioned, in a 3-inch thick blanket? The U.S. Geological Survey did their own studies of the dust, 2005, thousands of samples. What did they find in their particle atlas of the World Trade Center dust? Billions of what? Previously molten iron microspheres. We got to unpack that. They're previously molten. They form themselves into spheres. We'll get to that. They're iron, the byproduct of thermite, and up to 6% of these samples are composed of these molten iron microspheres. They don't know where they came from. They document them very carefully, but they don't even guess as to where they might have come from. There's up to 4 tons of this by extrapolation. How much is in one sample, judging by, we know how much tonnage there was of dust, at least 150,000 tons of it. 6% of it was previously molten iron microspheres, found by the R.J. Lee group also who said these are formed during the event, not before by the welders putting the building together, not afterward by the iron workers taking it apart, but during the destruction of the towers. They result from the melting of iron. It says or steel, but these are iron, elemental iron. So RJ Lee Group, very international environmental consulting group, very well known. The EPA says, gosh, we don't know what these are, but they're used as a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. Well, how did they get in the dust? Experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. If you don't know, then experiment and find out. That's what Stephen Jones, physicist, did here. He lights in this controlled experiment a small amount of thermite, which produces thousands of what look like sparks, but they're not sparks. They're molten iron spheres, which fall into the pan and cool and become previously molten iron microspheres. We know where those molten iron microspheres came from. They came from thermite. It's real clear. We know how they get spherical because that's just what aerosolized liquids do. They form themselves into spheres by surface tension, and then they fall. Could that be what explains the toasting of the tops of all of these cars outside the World Trade Center? Liquid, molten, falling spheres in this very high heat event, as the witnesses have told us. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, that's just unbelievable, the stuff I'm seeing here.
Me too. This is why I can give this presentation so many times and still be flabbergasted by how clear.
Seeing is believing, I'll tell you.
And this is evidence of the ignited thermite. What about unignited thermite? Is there any evidence of that in the dust? Let's see. A small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen analyzes 7 independently collected samples, tested 4 of them, like dust from this apartment across the street from the South Tower in Jeanette McKinley's apartment. She's an artist and she collected it. She used it in her art as a kind of a personal therapy because she was traumatized, as everybody in New York down there was. But this was right across the street from the South Tower, which blew up, blowing in all the windows of the Liberty Street apartment building, which she was an occupant of. All of the samples have these curious red-gray chips. They thought they were paint, but they do some analysis and they find that they're attracted by a magnet. They look like primer paint, right? But that's not attracted by a magnet. So that means it has a high iron content once again. So they get real curious. They zoom into the red layer. They analyze the red layer with X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy. What do they find? Iron, aluminum, the key ingredients of thermite, iron oxide. Iron oxide is essentially rust. Aluminum powder and iron oxide powder are the components of thermite. What's that doing there? Boy, do they get curious now. Now they zoom in with an electron microscope 50,000 times into that red layer. What do they find? Nano-sized particles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Engineered particles set in a matrix of organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic material is what they use in TNT to expand rapidly and as a gas and knock things over. That's how TNT works. Incendiaries work by means of heat. They burn things up at 4,000 degrees. No steel can handle it. So what they've done here is they've taken an incendiary, which works by means of heat, extreme heat, and turned it into a more explosive element. Interestingly, this was developed by Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos Lab, who did work on this material well before 9/11, 2001, and put it in the peer-reviewed paper. Well, they found that these chips of super thermite, is what they called it, at about 425 Celsius, they ignite. And that's the same thing that happened with these samples, the 4 that they collected, right about, all acted the same. Paint doesn't do this, by the way. Right. What happens when they ignite? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found in all the World Trade Center dust samples by R.J. Lee and the U.S. Geological Survey, with the same chemical signature. So we know exactly where those molten iron microspheres came from. It's not a mystery anymore. This is 2009. It became not a mystery after 2009, as if we didn't know. These molten iron microspheres are found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as we see here and here. You see, this is very sophisticated material. When you get this down to the nanoscale, chemical reactions happen virtually instantaneously because the surface volume increases exponentially, enabling an incendiary to become engineered to become more explosive. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So a real investigation that's willing to look at the peer-reviewed literature, like here in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal in 2009, by these 8 international engineers in this study, which remains uncontested, which found that the red layer of the red-gray chips is active, unreacted, thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. It's very clear what's going on here. In fact, if we want to know how it might have gotten into the World Trade Center towers, we might just look at the fireproofing upgrades that were going on in the years before 9/11, which happened to be, coincidentally, the locations where the jet planes impacted. So that's work that Kevin Ryan has unearthed in digwithin.net. So, yeah, we've got to get to a real investigation because what we found is that we have all 10 key characteristic features and some very uncharacteristic features, too, of controlled demolition, none of which can be explained by fire, let alone all of them. This is direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries and high-energy explosives. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and eyewitness testimony that we've shown, this is proof to many, in fact, of controlled demolition. In fact, more than 3,600 architects and engineers signed on to the petition, which can be found at richardgage911.org. And they appear, many of them, in the film that we are now producing, 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom, a film series that brings this evidence to the court, directly to a grand jury investigation, as a matter of fact. So we've submitted already 60 exhibits to the grand jury via the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. This film series will accompany those and tell the story graphically and by the experts themselves.
Hey, Richard, not to interrupt. When do you guys expect to hear something back from the grand jury? And how long ago what was this submitted to them?
We have submitted it to him in 2018. The U.S. Attorney has not given it to them. We've sued the U.S. Attorney, and that's gone to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
All the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would not hear the case, which puts us back to finding a federal judge to give this directly to a special grand jury, which we will be doing in 2024, along with this film series, which we expect to have done by the end of the winter. So that is the evidence that we don't want your audience or any other audience to be the last to know. You know, we don't have the mainstream media or even yet Tucker Carlson to bring this evidence to their audience. We're going to try to fix that. We're going to try to hook up with Tucker and several people at the America Fest conference this weekend in Phoenix. The convention, 10,000 people will be there. And we have a booth with all of this evidence in it, including our brochure, which we'll be giving away there about what really happened. 2 planes, 3 towers. The math doesn't add up at all, right? So this is the evidence that this is the outline of the evidence we've been talking about in these 3 sessions, John. And I want to make sure that that everybody has a chance to download for free this brochure or buy 100 of them or more and hand them out to people so we can get the word out.
Matter of fact, send that over to me and I'll print off a bunch for this weekend as well.
I'll bring 1,000 of them, John.
Yeah.
We'll hand them out together.
Absolutely. You bet.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to bring to the attention of our wonderful audience of yours today.
Well, you know, Richard, when you got the Supreme Court rejecting it, you've got the courts rejecting it. I mean, this tells you right here, this is the biggest cover-up of all time. This is the biggest, in my opinion.
It's got to be.
I mean, the federal government doesn't want to admit that they're responsible for thousands of deaths and how many people made that call for this to happen.
Yep.
I mean, there's a lot of top dogs out there that I can guarantee you are involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one.
Yeah, it goes all the way to the top. I agree. And I don't mean George Bush either.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, who knows? They might have even gotten to the Supreme Court judges. I mean, they might have flat out just said, make this go away.
Well, this is not a popular topic. This unearths conspiracy so deep and so wide that it threatens the foundations of our government, which is a good thing, because since this did happen and that conspiracy did occur, we've got to go all the way and root out the evil all the way to its core. And if that threatens our government, then so be it. The Constitution of the United States allows us and encourages us and gave us provisions for rectifying such a problem. And that's what we have to do, John.
Amen. I mean, well, you know, the Constitution says we're not to allow this kind of a corrupt government. And what do we see every day right now? Nothing but corruption.
Yep. It needs to be replaced. It is rotten to the core.
So
that's
I'll tell you what,
yeah,
you do a fantastic job going detail after detail into this. I mean, I can listen to you for hours on end because you're just so well explaining it, not just explaining it, showing the facts behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's key right there. Anybody can talk about it, but you're showing the facts right there with it.
Yep.
I mean, that makes all the difference.
That's what you got to do. And I'm willing to do it anywhere with anybody. So if any of you guys know of a podcaster, big or small, who needs to hear this evidence, needs their audience to hear it, I'm available. I have never turned down an interview request. So we've got to get the evidence out there. So give me a buzz on our website, richardgage911.org.
Yeah. What we need to do, Richard, is when we're down there at the Mary Fest this weekend, we need to get Tucker Carlson involved on this and get him to put this out over the air and have you do a 3-day session with him. This would be I know that would reach the whole world.
Yep, it would. And he's warming up. He's warmed up to the idea. He's put out Building 7. No way. Not going to buy it, And so he's ready. So let's corner him.
You got it. I'm ready. So anything else you'd like to share here tonight, Richard?
That would do it, other than to suggest that we don't want to sit on this, people. This is evidence that we need to wake people up. And the key documentary about this evidence that you can share with anyone, it's free on our website, richardgage911.org. It's called 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. I made the documentary years ago, and it is still as valid today as it was then.
Yep. So I'm asking all you guys out there, go to his website, watch the documentary, and please share this with every last person you know. Get this out all over America. I mean, and I've got 20-some thousand followers out here on Facebook, not including my YouTube and my Rumbles channels. Just start sharing this. Just make this go viral. Get this out there all across America. That's what we need.
Yeah, we really do, John.
We do. And then this will go out live here probably within an hour on your news. And this will actually reach almost every city across the country. So,
right on.
I mean, that we really need to get you on Tucker Carlson as well.
Yeah.
So, Richard,
and if Tucker, give him a buzz. Let him know.
Yep.
Look at Richard Gage 911. Look for him at AmFest, and we'll have a big booth there with all the evidence and the DVDs there. You can pick up these DVDs, by the way, there too.
Richard, I want to give you a special thanks for putting 3 days of your time to this, getting this out to my audience. And, I know this is time consuming. But I'm glad my audience got to hear it, and I know they're going to be sharing it.
Right on. Good work. Thanks everybody out there. Appreciate you. And John, thank you for having us on.
You bet. So looking forward to seeing you this Saturday, Richard.
Yep. We'll be there at amfest.com.
All right. Well, God bless, and we'll be talking to you soon.
All right. Take care, John.
All right. Bye-bye. All right, guys. So we're going to be at the America Fest this Saturday. That's going to be in Phoenix, Arizona. And I'll be live streaming the whole time down there. Be conducting several interviews while I'm there as well. And from there, Richard is actually going to go to the border with me. We're going to try to get some of these officials that's going to be there at this event to come to the border with us as well. And just keep our team in your thoughts and prayers. And we'll just continue moving forward with this. We've got a fight ahead of us. We've got a corrupt government, as you guys have seen. We've got invasions on our borders. This 9/11 stuff right here just blew me away. Just watching and seeing the evidence presented this way. Never have I seen this presented in such great fashion that is just totally understand. I mean, a child could understand this. That's how simple he made this for everybody. So, other than that, guys, God bless you, and appreciate you guys tuning in tonight. This is Johnathon Alexander reporting live with Live Border News.